your phones to silent, or better yet, turn them off if you hadn't already thought of doing so. And having said so, I should probably first very briefly introduce myself. My name is Ronnie Hussein. Pleased to meet you all. I'm a member of the Hele Dispute FIB, which is co-organizing this lecture together with the Dutch United Nations Student Association. We're actually part of the association, and also with the external committee, which played no small part in organizing this, I should definitely add. And tonight we're going to talk about something very topical, something very recent, something that's been in the news and in a lot of debates on TV during the last couple of weeks, and will probably be in the news even more for the next week or so. We're talking about the association agreement between the European Union on one hand and all of its member states, and on the other hand the Dutch government. So, I'm sorry, on the other hand of course Ukraine. So, why has this been in the news? Well, as you might have heard, there's going to be a referendum. There is a law in the Netherlands now on referenda, which basically says if there's 300,000 Dutch citizens who want a referendum, they can have their referendum. And that referendum will take place on the 6th of April, so that's next week. So for all of you who haven't yet decided what they're going to vote, this is of course a perfect opportunity to decide and to get informed. So, in order to get informed, you need an expert, right? You need somebody who can speak on this topic with some authority. And I'm very, very pleased and proud to be able to tell you that we have just such an authority. We really have a very special, very interesting and intelligent speaker who knows his stuff. Our speaker of tonight is Eugene Joly. I hope I pronounced it correctly. I think I'm probably about 80% there, hopefully, who is an esteemed lawyer, actually in Canada, a Ukrainian-Canadian lawyer who is a partner at a very prestigious and big law firm in Montreal called Lezing. And he's also the president, serving for a second term, of the Ukrainian World Congress, which is basically a platform organization which looks after the interests of Ukrainian diaspora all over the world. So there's about 20 million Ukrainians who are actually in one way or the other represented by this organization, of which Mr. Joly is actually the president. So we have an authority to be sure. Just recently, of course, I looked up what he's been up to recently, and I saw all these pictures where he's talking with Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, and the prime minister, and all the bigwigs. They're talking to our speaker of tonight. So even though you might not have heard the name before, I can assure you that we're quite lucky to have him. He happens to be in Europe because, well, not just because of the referendum, but because he's received an honorary doctorate in Ukraine. So he's basically traveling through. So it's really our luck that we can have him here as our speaker tonight. And I've discussed the lecture briefly with him before I started, of course, and he's going to introduce most of the topic about the recent developments in Ukraine, of course, and the legal consequences of the referendum and whether or not it's a good idea to vote yes. He will introduce all of these things himself. So without further ado, because I've been talking long enough by now, I would like to invite our honorable speaker to the floor, and I would like to invite the audience to give a very, very warm applause to Eugene Joly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organizers for organizing this event. I was allotted 45 minutes to speak to you, but I might not use that right fully. Namely because I heard this speaker that came and was invited to speak at a banquet, and he started to speak in the evening, and people had done their full day of work and were a bit tired, and the speaker just went on and started to speak, and eventually in the first row a couple of elderly people were looking and watching, and eventually, as an individual wants to fall asleep starts doing, his head started to wave forward, backward, eyelids going up and down, and nothing stops the speaker. And eventually the gentleman kept trying as much as he could to listen, and eventually fell asleep. speaker kept on going. Eventually, what normal people do when they fall asleep, he started to snore. So he snores, the speaker speaks louder, the individual snores even harder, and eventually the speaker looks and says, "Madam, would you be kind enough to wake up your husband? I cannot speak louder." And she said, "You put him asleep, please wake him up yourself." So in order for me not to put anyone asleep, I might not use the full 45 minutes, but that's going to give us an opportunity to discuss various issues related to the European Association Agreement that might be relevant for you. It gives me great pleasure to address you today on a very important issue that could define in a marked way the course of modern history, namely the referendum on the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. I am well aware that this referendum is for the citizens of the Netherlands, and I respect your right to vote without any undue outside influence. I also strongly believe, as I am sure that you do, the choices are best made when individuals have access to as much information as possible and can participate in open dialogue. That is why I appreciate this opportunity to meet with you today, and I look forward to our exchange of ideas. As was already said, I am a Canadian of Ukrainian descent whose parents emigrated to Canada after the Second World War, fleeing two oppressive regimes in search of a better life in a country where every individual is respected, regardless of ethnicity, race, religion, education, or social status, where fundamental rights and freedoms are the norm as opposed to the exception. And I consider myself very fortunate to have been raised in Canada, to have enjoyed the opportunity to pursue my goals and ambitions there, and to know that my children and grandchildren will have the same opportunities. The most significant opportunity that has shaped who I am today and why I stand before you today was the opportunity afforded to me by Canada to develop and maintain my Ukrainian cultural identity in a very public way. Your country has also warmly welcomed many Ukrainians throughout the years who have made the Netherlands their home and who have contributed to this country. For instance, a very talented musicologist and choir conductor, Miroslav Antonovich, was forced to flee Ukraine during the Second World War and settled in the Netherlands. In 1951, he founded the Utrecht Byzantine Choir, also known as the Lezing choir. What makes this choir unique is that the Utrecht Byzantine Choir sings church and folk-inspired classical music in impeccable Ukrainian, and it is composed almost entirely of Dutch singers. My first introduction to this beautiful choir was in my hometown in Montreal when I was still living at home with my parents, and my father organized a concert for this choir during their cross-Canada tour. Later, in 2010, when I traveled to The Hague to meet with then OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, Knut Vollebæk, I had the opportunity to hear the Byzantine choir at the St. Nicholas Basilica in Eiselstein. Did I get that right? Perfect. Province of Utrecht. This choir was then conducted by another Ukrainian who made the Netherlands her home, Irina Gorbanko. For their important contribution to music and multiculturalism, the Utrecht Byzantine Choir and its tenor, Paul Hakenes, were recipients in 2008 of the highest honor of the Ukrainian World Congress, namely the St. Volodymyr Medal. The Ukrainian community in the Netherlands numbers over 7,000, has a vibrant community life, and actively contributes to this country's development. I address you today, as was already said, as President of the Ukrainian World Congress, or the UWC, the international coordinating body representing the interests of over 20 million people with Ukrainian origins living outside Ukraine, including the Netherlands. The UWC coordinates a network of member and community organizations in 49 countries in the world. The UWC is a totally independent body and does not receive any funding from Ukraine's government, nor from any other government in the world. In 2003, the UWC was recognized by the United Nations Economic and Social Council as an NGO with special consultative status. I am a volunteer volunteer and do not receive any form of remuneration for my work as UWC president. The UWC has focused on such important matters as the protection and defense of human and national minority rights and combating human trafficking, the promotion of democratic reforms in Ukraine, the monitoring of presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine, as well as issues that define Ukrainian community life, including initiatives in education, social services, culture, and sport. Over the past year, the UWC has actively supported the Ukrainian people in their struggle to protect Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity, and provided substantial humanitarian aid, including for the victims of violence who are on the front lines in eastern Ukraine, to whom we provide standardized, improved first aid kits with appropriate training on how to use them. Our humanitarian initiative, Patriot Defense, has improved tactical medicine in Ukraine, developing a formal educational program based on NATO standards. The UWC also contributes to the dissemination of accurate information on the situation in Ukraine. Over the last years, the UWC has actively promoted the signing and ratification of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement as a huge step in Ukraine's democratic development and a golden opportunity for all the EU member states. This agreement was ultimately signed on June 27, 2014, and ratified by all 28 EU member states, including the Netherlands. What is it? What is the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement? The EU has association agreements with more than 25 states and regions in the world, including Georgia, Israel, Lebanon, Moldova, as well as Central American and South American countries. The main purpose of such agreements is to strengthen trade and economic cooperation. The EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, or this association agreement as I will refer to it, is an instrument which reflects the strategic importance of EU-Ukraine relations. It is very comprehensive, covering all areas of interest, contains rules-based provisions and cooperation arrangements, and provides for both political association and economic integration. This association agreement also includes a deep and comprehensive free trade area, or the DCFTA. With all of its key elements, this association agreement builds a long-term foundation for EU-Ukraine relations without prejudging on any possible EU membership for Ukraine in the future. This association agreement focuses on support for core reforms, economic recovery and growth, governance and sector cooperation in such areas as energy, transport, environmental protection, industrial and small and medium enterprise cooperation, social development and protection, equal rights, consumer protection, education, training and youth, as well as cultural cooperation. The foundation of this association agreement is the reinforcement of common values, notably democracy and rule of law, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, good governance, a market economy, and sustainable development. This association agreement will enhance cooperation in foreign and security policy, with a focus on regional issues, weapons of mass destruction, non-proliferation and disarmament, conflict prevention, and crisis management. The DCFTA, which is the core of this association agreement, goes much further than classic free trade areas and provides for two specific areas of commitment. First, the EU and Ukraine commit to move progressively towards duty-free trade. Such trade liberalization is at the core of all free trade agreements the EU has signed with numerous countries all over the world, and is based on empirical evidence that opening up markets is a win-win process, leading to more trade, more jobs, and lower prices. And two, Ukraine commits to adopt a number of EU norms and standards on foods, industrial and consumer goods, as well as EU rules on services, competition, public procurement, and intellectual property. Trade between the EU and Ukraine will become easier. This implies no changes to EU regulations, only to the Ukrainian legislation. Ukraine will be obliged to adopt EU rules and standards. Justice, freedom, and security will be protected with measures addressing the rule of law, data protection, migration, the fight against money laundering and financing of terrorism, illicit drugs, the fight against organized crime, and counterterrorism. Energy is addressed in this association agreement with particular focus on issues concerning security of supply, the gradual integration of energy markets, energy efficiency, renewable energy sources, and nuclear safety. Generally, this association agreement will serve to enhance cooperation in some 28 key sector policy areas with the goal of bringing them in line with EU laws and where relevant international norms and standards. Association agreements are usually applied provisionally before they are ratified, so that all the partners can immediately reap the benefits of free trade. The EU-Ukraine Association Agreement has been provisionally applied since November 2014, and the DCFTA component came into effect on January 1 of this year. The provisional application of this association agreement has already significantly impacted Ukraine, which has begun its journey along a very challenging but rewarding path of reform. Needless to say that corruption, rooted in over half a century of Soviet subjugation, is the issue that required the most attention. Fortunately, a genuine anti-corruption strategy has been developed and is in the process of being implemented. Among the most significant initiatives was the establishment of a National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the membership of which was selected through a transparent competition with the participation of international organizations. Currently, under investigation are 80 cases of corruption by a range of individuals and institutions, including civil servants, directors of public companies, members of the State Prosecutor's Office, and educational institutions. A special anti-corruption division was created in the Office of the State Prosecutor with the specific mandate of investigating allegations of corruption. This division is currently investigating 20 allegations against members of Ukraine's Cabinet of Ministers. Last month, the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption came into effect with a mandate of overseeing and implementing national anti-corruption policies. It is currently developing an electronic registry for the public disclosure of assets by civil servants, and it will also be responsible for overseeing political party financing. Other highlights include public access to state property registers. In fact, over 300 registers and databases are in the process of opening. An e-data resource was launched to ensure full transparency of all government spending, and e-services for the citizens were introduced with over 20% of the documents currently available online. In fact, during the one-year period, beginning December 2014 through December 2015, Ukraine has either adopted or drafted new laws and developed reform strategies in just under 50 specific areas of national interest. Allow me to highlight only a few of these areas and the critical steps taken forward. On enhancing security, a new police force was established, and by spring of 2016, new patrol brigades will patrol the streets of 29 Ukrainian cities and towns. Ukrainian citizens will now be able to obtain a passport with a contactless electronic chip for travel abroad. The civil service will now be regulated by a new law which envisages its depolitization, efficiency, and independence. The law also provides for the establishment of a fund to increase salaries for civil servants. And an e-data resource was launched to ensure full transparency of all government spending. On economic policy, the number of taxes and fees were cut from 22 to 11. The number of regulating bodies was reduced from 56 to 28. The number of permits for doing business was reduced from 143 to 84. And the number of licenses from 56 to 30. Compulsory certificates for 13 products were abolished. The law on ensuring transparent activity of the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine was adopted. Electronic VAT administration was introduced, and the first stage of deregulation and simplification of procedures for cargo registration in seaports was completed. On the management of state assets, for the first time, financial statements of the 100 largest state-owned enterprises were prepared and a financial audit was mandated. A competitive selection of 277 heads of state-owned enterprises was implemented. A list of state-owned property of strategic importance to the economy and security was approved. A list of 345 companies subjected to privatization was passed. On food policy, food markets were diversified to overcome the effects caused by the Russian embargo. The share of products exported to the Russian market decreased to 2%. The markets of 9 countries were opened for the dairy and meat industries. 238 enterprises got permission to supply products to the EU markets within the year. The first stage of deregulation in the agricultural sector took place. 14 certificates and 6 licenses were cancelled, and more than 50 amendments to the legislation have been made. On energy independence, the energy security of Ukraine has been strengthened, and the supply routes were significantly diversified. A plan of measures to reform the gas sector, as agreed with the World Bank and the energy community, was approved. The gas supply from Europe was increased by 2.5 times, and the gas supply from the Russian Federation was reduced by 53%. Natural gas consumption was reduced by 20.4%. On social policy, pensions, salaries, and social payments to citizens are paid up. Privileges and special pensions to ministers, MPs, and other officials were revoked. The living wage was increased by 13.1%, and a law on external labor migration was passed, which for the first time protects at the state level the social rights of labor migrants and their family members. On education and science, the Parliament passed a government bill on scientific and scientific technical activities, which modifies the process of scientific research. The Horizon 2020 agreement with the EU has been signed and ratified. This is the biggest EU research and innovation program ever, with nearly 80 billion euros of funding available over 7 years, in addition to the private investment that this money will attract. On youth and sport, the Ministry of Youth and Sport and state-owned enterprises subordinated to it switched to e-procurement, an initiative that will save about 6 million Ukrainian hryvnias. On cultural policy, a long-term strategy in support of Ukrainian culture was developed. Ukraine joined the EU Creative Europe program, opening up additional opportunities for cooperation between Ukrainian and European artists. For the first time in Ukraine, expenditures related to the protection of museums, libraries, and nature reserves became a secured item in the national budget. On international aid, an agreement on a 4-year, $17.5 billion US cooperation program with the IMF was concluded. Additional international amount of 7.2 billion US from official and multilateral partners was obtained. The restructuring of public and publicly guaranteed debt was completed, and the implementation of a joint international technical assistance project titled Financial Development of NGOs was launched with the US Agency for International Development, totaling 2.09 million US. Finally, on the government's performance, Ukraine rose by 29 points in the Doing Business ranking relative to 2014, and in the area of business registration by 40 points. The World Bank forecasts the growth of Ukraine's GDP in 2016 by 1%, in 2017 by 2%, and in 2018 by 3%. According to the Global Competitiveness Index of the World Economic Forum, Ukraine improved in the following two categories. Government's efficiency rose by 11 points as compared to 2014, and the transparency of public policy rose by 32 points as compared to 2013. And the Global Open Data Index ranks Ukraine 58 for public data openness among 134 countries. All this to say that reforms may not be moving as quickly as some may hope, but they are clearly and irreversibly moving forward. This association agreement is ensuring that Europe moves slowly toward Ukraine, that Europe embraces Ukraine, and that Europe assists Ukraine to implement comprehensive reforms. This association agreement, with its provisions, will above all strengthen the rule of law in Ukraine, strengthen its democracy, and strengthen the protection of human rights. What is the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement not about? This association agreement is not about Ukraine's membership in the European Union. There is not a single provision in the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement that refers to EU membership, nor has there been any commitment to Ukraine from the EU to that effect. This association agreement is not about providing financial support to Ukraine. The EU has been providing support to Ukraine for a long time as part of its cooperation and development aid, but this is not linked to this association agreement, and there is no new commitment to greater financial support from the EU to Ukraine in this association agreement. This association agreement is not about opening the EU to Ukrainian laborers nor migrants. There is no provision giving enhanced freedom of movement to Ukrainian citizens into or inside the EU. On this point, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that despite the foreign aggression in eastern Ukraine, which has forced over 1.5 million Ukrainians to flee their homes, these displaced Ukrainians have not been flowing across the borders to seek refuge in Europe. To the contrary, many have already returned to their homes, while others have resettled in other regions of Ukraine with the help of fellow Ukrainians until they too are able to return safely home. And finally, this association agreement is not about Ukraine joining NATO and includes no such provisions. So what are the benefits of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement for the Netherlands? The Netherlands will have open access to Ukraine's market of 45 million consumers, and this market will be much more familiar for the Dutch as Ukraine commits in this association agreement to adopt EU norms and standards. Once Ukraine aligns its business laws, regulations, and procedures with European standards, trade with Ukraine for Dutch companies will essentially be the same as trading with any other EU member state. Businesses wanting to trade with Ukraine will no longer need to consider what rules they have to comply with, how those rules differ from those of the EU, or how they can obtain certification from either EU or Ukrainian authorities. This standardization will secure an equal playing field for all concerned. At the beginning of 2016, the Netherlands was the second largest investor in the economy of Ukraine and among the top 3 investor countries since 2013. As of January 1, 2016, investors from the Netherlands had invested 5.6 billion US or 12.9 of Ukraine's foreign investment. These Dutch investments will be better protected by new competition rules that Ukraine will implement in accordance with this association agreement. Companies from the Netherlands already have a significant business presence in Ukraine. About 320 Dutch companies are working in Ukraine, half of which are engaged in agriculture and food production, while the rest are working in financial services, logistics, business and IT services, as well as energy, construction, and the wood industry. The DCFTA between the EU and Ukraine will only contribute to an increase in trade and business by Dutch companies in Ukraine. This association agreement will simplify trade with the gradual liquidation of most customs tariffs between the EU and Ukraine, contributing to the continued lowering of expenses in conducting trade and a general increase in the volume of trade. Indeed, on the annual exports of about 775 million euros from the Netherlands to Ukraine, the average import duties decrease from 5.7% to 2.9%. Moreover, the percentage of these exports that enter Ukraine free of any duty immediately increased from 53% to 72%, and in 10 years, that percentage will even be higher. It will grow to 98%. In addition, in 10 years, the percentage of the annual imports of about 725 million euros that enter the Netherlands from Ukraine free of any duty will increase from 43% to 78%. It is worth noting that the Netherlands will have a greater protection of tariffs on protected goods, including cocoa and chocolate, since by 2026, only 78% of Ukrainian goods will enter the Netherlands free of any duty, as opposed to 98% for Dutch goods entering Ukraine. According to research commissioned by your Ministry of Economical Affairs, with this association agreement, the Dutch livestock industry and bioenergy sector could benefit from Ukraine's supply of such raw materials as cereal, feed grain, and oilseed. Dutch export opportunities increase in traditional areas such as dairy, potatoes, and horticultural products, as well as input supplies and services, including knowledge transfers. There are already many success stories of business people from the Netherlands working and prospering in Ukraine. Allow me to share a few that reveal not only the motivation of Dutch individuals and attraction to work in Ukraine, but their faith in the future of Ukraine. I'm quoting excerpts from interviews conducted in Ukraine by the broadcaster Ukraine Today in cooperation with Euromaidan Press. Mr. Nard Elsman, General Director of the project Doing Dutch Business in Ukraine, stated, and I quote, "Ukraine and the Netherlands are very connected, especially if you look at the agricultural sphere. The Netherlands are very innovative all over the world, and Ukraine is the largest economical agricultural country in Europe itself. There's a lot of innovation here. The young entrepreneurs in Ukraine are very aggressive, very eager to learn. They have only one problem. They don't know where to start, they don't know where to go, and they don't have money. That's a problem. give them a direction, you give them the tools, and they are professional, money will follow as well. But you have to do it step by step. Mr. Dirk Schmitz van Ooyen is the managing director of Pro Marketing, a company that grows grains and oilseeds and imports equipment for the food processing industry. He stated the following: Ukraine is one of the biggest countries in Europe. It's the size of France with 45 million inhabitants. It's bordering the European Union. It's a country which suffered from stagnation due to Soviet history, which means there's a huge opportunity for development and investment in practically every area you can imagine. Every area needs modernization, whether it's agriculture, machine building, or IT. There are lots of opportunities for cooperation between the Netherlands and Ukraine. Ukraine is a country with a tremendous agricultural potential. The agricultural area is the size of 25% of the agricultural area of the entire EU. So it's a huge food producer, and that offers lots of opportunities for Dutch companies who are very good at producing machines and technology for the agricultural and food processing sector. If you imagine that Ukraine today has about 5% of all the storage capacity that it needs for all these vegetables, and a lot goes to waste, it's about taking away barriers for both sides to do business with each other. There can be little objection against taking away barriers, bringing them to the European and Dutch level, which is very beneficial for everybody in this region, the EU and Ukraine. I'm extremely optimistic about Ukraine. I've seen the strength of civil society and the desire to change the country for the better. This desire was strong enough to break the resistance that existed in political elites, and perhaps still exists in some political elites. And that will drive change. Young people, civil society, will drive change and make Ukraine a European country. I'm proud to be here as a Dutch businessman. Mr. Arno Kleibroek is the founder and owner of ATM Trade Management, providing legal and practical support to foreign investors in the Ukrainian market since 2000. Here's what he had to say. From the end of last year, we again see an influx in our business of new clients that wanted to start new businesses here or extend existing business. The mood is definitely more positive. And of course, the association agreement is the major motor in that doing business really does become easier. Also, already simpler for Dutch exporters, it is already cheaper, easier to get the products in, which everybody of course is hopeful will help in developing the export of Dutch products to Ukraine. Mr. Mikkel Koenders is the commercial director of Galicia Greenery, an agricultural company that grows produce year-round in greenhouses. His comments are the following. For us, it's important with the association agreement that we can do transparent business, which is the same rules for everybody. We are a trading country, so this country has a huge potential in people that are demanding fresh products. The biggest advantage for the Netherlands is trading, easy and transparent trading. Also, the labor force here, if you see what is going on here on the IT level, it's much higher than everywhere else. It's not without a reason that so many Dutch companies start their IT business here. Nestle is outsourcing. People from all over the world are here with IT. There are educated people. This country has a huge future for that. As a trading country, how can we refuse such a huge market? It's the road Ukraine chose to go, the European way. For me, it's another step to accomplish this, to get European norms in this country is the way of doing business. What you see with the new police, I have already seen that things are changing on a touchable level. It's important to see things really changing on the streets. They are really doing their best to weed out corruption. And of course, they are not there yet. It's not like everything is good already. But for me, the most important thing is that they made a decision in which direction to go. These testimonies by Dutch businessmen indicate that Ukraine is indeed forging ahead with its democratization and with its plans to become more like your country, more like any European country. This association agreement will ultimately contribute to securing a free, democratic, stable, peaceful, and prospering Ukraine. In that sense, this association agreement is EU's investment into democracy, security, stability, and prosperity in a larger part of Europe. What else does Ukraine offer today? Ukraine is the largest country in Europe geographically and ranks number 6 in Europe in terms of population. Ukraine has a rich history and culture and boasts 7 World Heritage Sites. Ukraine has a diverse population with over 130 nationalities. Ukraine has a 99.7 literacy rate and the 4th most educated population in the world. Over 70% have a secondary or higher education. Civil society has developed in answer to the needs of the population. In 2014, 63% of Ukrainians donated to the army, internally displaced persons, and to other societal needs. Ukraine is a leader in global agro-export with 33% of the world's black earth soil. It is the number 1 exporter of sunflower oil and number 2 exporter globally of grains. Ukraine is the number 1 software engineering force in Central and Eastern Europe. 16,000 IT students graduate each year. Over 100 global companies have software research and development facilities in Ukraine. IT outsourcing has grown 20 times over the past decade, and Ukraine is in the top 3 by number of certified IT professionals. Ukraine has a full-scale aerospace industry with 5,000 aerospace graduates every year. The Mriya 225 is the largest cargo airplane ever built, transporting up to 250 tons of cargo. The pharmaceutical industry has experienced 15% growth annually for the last 5 years. E-commerce has grown 5 times over the last 5 years. It now takes only 2 days to open a business in Ukraine. Easily accessible, Ukraine is 2 truck days away from most European cities. 4 out of 10 European transport corridors run through Ukraine, which has 170,000 kilometers of roadways and 22,000 kilometers of railways. The stakes in this referendum for the Netherlands and all of Europe are incredibly high. You and your fellow citizens will decide whether the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, already ratified by all 28 EU member states, including the Netherlands, should remain as is, or whether you wish your country to undo it. A no vote would essentially mean that the majority of the Dutch people are turning their back to the Ukrainian people. A no vote would signal to Ukraine that the Netherlands are not interested in everything Ukraine has to offer and lack confidence in its potential. A no vote would call into question Europe's global image of a stable and well-functioning geopolitical bloc. A no vote would throw the future of the EU's Eastern Partnership into question opening the door to Russian ambitions in this part of Europe while raising many European security concerns. A no vote will bolster the forces from both within as well as outside Ukraine to push east, and Russia will seize this opportunity to continue pulling Ukraine into its sphere of influence, a goal Russia has never relinquished since the fall of the Soviet Union. The EU-Ukraine Association Agreement was the catalyst for the Euromaidan in Ukraine. In the cold winter months of 2013 and 14, thousands of protesters demonstrated daily on Euromaidans throughout Ukraine. They demonstrated not for some social issue, not for an increase in salary or higher pensions. They stood for an ideal, the right to live with dignity in a democratic European country. They indicated in no uncertain terms to Ukraine's authorities and the EU leadership that Ukrainians embrace Europe. Numerous prominent Europeans appeared on the central Euromaidan in Kyiv and publicly declared their support and solidarity with the Ukrainian people. This reinforced the strength, courage, determination, and unwavering resolve of the Ukrainian people to move forward toward Europe and not backward toward a revamped Soviet Union under the guise of either a customs union or a Eurasian union. For that, the protesters were detained, kidnapped, humiliated, savagely beaten, and even killed by snipers. Amazingly, they stood their ground and eventually brought down a highly corrupt and authoritarian regime that was actively backed by the Russian Federation. Euromaidan's ultimate victory was certainly a wonderful victory for the Ukrainian people, but it was also an important victory for Europe, and it was a remarkable victory for democracy. Unfortunately, a well-deserved celebration by Ukrainians and Europeans alike of Euromaidan's victory was short-lived because little green men invaded Crimea and then attacked eastern Ukraine. Russia did not just send little green men into Ukraine. Russia launched a hybrid war against Ukraine that includes a well-financed disinformation campaign aimed at convincing Europe, including the Dutch, that Ukraine is a failed state. The dramatic consequences of Russia's aggression against eastern Ukraine are as follows. Over 9,000 people killed, 20,000 people wounded, 1.5 million people, including almost 200,000 children, internally displaced, and there are 30,000 hectares of Ukraine's land contaminated by Russian landmines. Incredibly, these tremendous losses and sacrifices have only made the Ukrainian people stronger in their resolve to continue on their European path free of Russian influence. Over recent months, there have been many appeals from Ukrainians to the Dutch people with respect to the upcoming referendum. Appeals for a chance to realize their choice. 26 national minorities in Ukraine wrote the following. Currently, Ukraine is experiencing one of the most dramatic moments in its history. The Ukrainian nation, composed of many ethnic and religious groups, has made its civilizational choice to become not only geographical, but a true part of European civilization, to overcome the consequences of totalitarian and imperial past, and to enter the family of free nations which are building their future based on shared values. For that choice, we have paid a terrible price. We have been subjected to military aggression. A part of our territory was occupied. There's a hybrid war against our country. But we are determined to defend our right to freedom and independence, and we think the Dutch people, with their history, with their centuries-old struggle for the right to live as free people in their country, can understand and support us. Ukrainian Pen wrote, "For us, the association agreement is not about the economy, if only because, due to restrictive tariffs and trade barriers in crucial sectors, the EU will benefit most in the short and medium term. It is not even about the possibility of membership, however desirable. Most Ukrainians actually recognize its current infeasibility, and the agreement does not envisage anything of the kind. Rather, the agreement is about Ukrainians becoming fully European. It's about guidance and guardianship, about learning by doing, about the conditionality machine that makes further cooperation between the EU and Ukraine dependent on the speed and scope of implemented reforms. It is up to the Dutch people to make their choice. We can only appeal to your moral sense, humanistic tradition, and strategic concern for the continent's future." More than 80 former political prisoners from former Soviet republics issued this appeal to the Dutch population to vote in favor of the agreement. It turned out to fight for the values is much easier than to live in accordance with them. Probably everyone knows it from his own experience. To move the focus from survival to self-expression, from authoritarian norms to democratic values, under conditions of acute geopolitical threat from Russia, is difficult. So Ukraine needs time. End of quote. The EU-Ukraine Association Agreement offers Ukrainians a chance. Maybe their only chance for the next very long time. This association agreement will not solve all of Ukraine's problems overnight. The burden remains on Ukraine to implement difficult reforms, but this association agreement will transform Ukraine for the benefit of the Netherlands, the European community, and global peace and security. I ask you today to listen to the people of Ukraine. They are just like you. Just like you. The Ukrainian people wish to live freely and with dignity in a democratic, prosperous, and successful European country in which fundamental freedoms and basic human rights are respected and the rule of law prevails. Welcome them and everything Ukraine has to offer to you and to your country. The possibilities are truly endless, and you will reap the benefits from a positive response much sooner than you think. Once Ukraine succeeds in protecting its independence and territorial integrity, in implementing serious reforms that will ingrain democracy and significantly reduce corruption, and in overcoming its current economic crisis to become a flourishing European country, this will be the greatest modern day success story, not only for Ukraine, but also for the EU and its member states, including the Netherlands. I assure you that this will happen. And when you look back, you will be proud to have contributed to such success instead of having blocked it. when I look at you, I see that most of you are my 3 children's age. And I'm concerned that your generation lives in a dangerous world with indiscriminate violence, as the recent terrorist attacks in Brussels have shown. That is why whenever an opportunity arises to render this world more stable, more secure, and more democratic, we should seize it and not let go. A fully European Ukraine will make this world better, safer, and more secure. That is why, beyond all the ads, statistics, arguments, speeches, debates, the yes campaign, and the no campaign, I ask you to do the right thing in our collective best interest, yours and mine. I ask you to do what your conscience dictates, and I trust that when you do that, you will make the right choice. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for those very, very inspiring words. As is our tradition, we'll have a very, very short break for everybody to stretch their legs and let everything sink in. We'll be back here within 10 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully ample opportunity to enter into some Q&A, some discussion, and ask all of our questions, as I'm sure many have been raised by this stirring lecture. See you in a few minutes. Thank you. So, after that very interesting and at the end, I think also very stirring and serious admonition to us as Dutch voters, I'm sure that there's lots of questions, maybe some comments or even some criticism. So I would like to invite all those present in the audience to raise their hand if they have any question. It's always hard to get started, of course, but once we get going, I'm sure that there will be plenty of discussion. So I see 3 questions to start with. So let's start in the back, and then I'll get to the front. Okay?
I was just surprised you said criticism. I don't think that was in the program.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that's something that we do a lot here at SIB. As a matter of fact, I might even turn into the devil's advocate if necessary. Please stand up and mention your name and then ask your question.
Hello, thanks for your interesting lecture. My name is Lex Panneman. Last weekend I watched the discussion program, Dutch discussion program on political issues at Buitenhof, and I saw a discussion right on this issue. And an economist said that one drawback of the treaty was that the poorest of the Ukrainians would, in fact, become even poorer as a consequence of this treaty. And yes, that is one of the drawbacks. My question is this true? And do you see any drawbacks from this treaty for Ukrainians themselves?
I think that clearly Ukraine has been negotiating that with a team of experts for over 4 years, if not 5. This has been analyzed from all sides and perspective, and I think that this is an agreement that is clearly a win-win agreement for both sides. Now, clearly, when one needs to implement numerous changes in order for Ukraine's legislation and regulations to be in conformity with European standards, that transition period may not be an easy one. And if there's any drawback to this, it's the fact that one must go through a transition period in order to get to something better. But I think that clearly notwithstanding how difficult a transition period will be, the Ukrainian population, and I travel enough to Ukraine, and I meet not only government authorities, but I meet a very, very strong civil society. Now that civil society was outside during the whole Euromaidan for that reason. That society is willing and ready to make those sacrifices. So I think that clearly a transition is never an easy exercise, but today the society is motivated to go through that transition, to make the necessary changes, and I think once it does, I think that it will be a win-win for both sides, and I do not see that negative analysis or assessment that are made by some economists.
Thank you. Thank you. I was wondering one thing. You mentioned Euromaidan briefly in passing during your lecture, but I was just wondering how many of people here know what Euromaidan exactly is? Who has a good idea of what exactly it entails? Because I can imagine that for some people it's not entirely clear. So maybe you could elaborate on it a little bit so that people have the context.
I think what I was saying in Ukraine, and thank you for pointing that out, in Ukraine the agreement was negotiated for almost 5 years. And the previous president of Ukraine was supposed to sign the agreement in November 2013 in Lithuania. 1 week prior to the signing, in great part because of Russian pressure, the president of Ukraine decided not to sign. He announced that he will not sign the association agreement. That brought people on the street, and eventually the movement got greater. The number of people that protested against that decision grew bigger and bigger with every day. Unfortunately, as very often happens when authoritarian regimes are challenged, they lose control, and unfortunately they lose their mind. And when they lost their mind, they sent forces to beat students, to kidnap students, to beat people that were protesting, to kidnap them, and that only got the numbers higher and higher and higher. And eventually, the Ukrainian authorities sent actually snipers to shoot at the protesters, and 100 Ukrainians died from sniper wounds. And that ultimately brought down then the regime. And that is what the people went through. So when I answered your question about determination, that period was during the winter months of December of 2013 and the early winter months of 2014, when people just stood on Ukraine's central Maidan or square in Kyiv, and that Maidan was repeated in various Maidans across Ukraine and across the world. So it was basically, it began as a protest vote to the president of Ukraine's decision to refuse to sign the association agreement. And then eventually, when the authorities savagely attacked the protesters, it turned, the Euromaidan was then, for a lot, became the revolution of dignity, where people said, enough of this, we want to live in dignity in this country. We want to live in a democratic country where fundamental freedoms and human rights are respected. So ultimately, for Ukrainians, Euromaidan means people taking their future, their destiny into their hands and becoming an authoritarian regime to gain the right to live in dignity in their own country.
Thank you. I think that clarifies a lot probably. So the association agreement has really been something that was discussed, I think, even since 2008 already. So this has a long history for the Ukrainians, and it's a very politically, I guess, important signal or symbol of hope. By the way, if anybody is interested in that history, of course, I also watched some documentaries, and there's a recent documentary on Netflix called Winter on Fire, which I think gives you a very poignant image of what was actually took place in Ukraine, particularly in Kiev, from November 2013 to February 2014. So that might be interesting as well.
Yes.
We have two questions here, so please.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Malit, and I was just wondering, in the discussion about the association treaty, an important argument for the association is a vote no is a vote for Russia, and I was wondering, to what extent is this true? How big is the threat of Russia for Ukraine?
Well, I think clearly President Putin has, in my assessment, not too many qualities. But he has one that he very often says very clearly what he means. And it's so outrageous that people are dismissive of such statements and say that cannot be. But President Putin has very clearly stated that Ukraine, during one of a summit, he turned to George Bush and said, you know, George, Ukraine is not even a state. And Russia accepts Ukraine. When I say accept, I mean in quote, accepts Ukraine's independence only insofar as Ukraine does exactly what Russia wants it to do, both in foreign and domestic policy. Russia has clearly, Euromaidan's victory was not only a victory for the Ukrainian people within, it was also a victory for the Ukrainian people over President Putin's declaration that he made two statements. That statement that I just quoted, and he made another statement when he said that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical crisis of the 20th century. And then he predicted that by 2015, he will reconstruct it. He was on record saying that with the customs union and then with the Eurasian Union, he will reconstruct the Soviet Union. So Euromaidan did two things. It got rid of an authoritarian, corrupt regime in Ukraine, and it challenged and actually overcame and eliminated Russia's president prediction that by 2015 he will have reconstructed the Soviet Union with this Eurasian Union. And I think that the fact that President Putin has sent his little green man to Crimea and in eastern Ukraine is essentially because he just cannot accept the fact that he got humiliated on that issue, and he does not accept the fact that Ukrainians have chosen unequivocally, and unequivocally, when I say unequivocally, I measure my words, it's unequivocal and it's across the board. It's not just Western Ukraine, it's Ukraine across from east to west, from north to south, have decided to go towards Europe. And I think that for President Putin, it essentially means that with Ukraine outside of Russia's sphere of influence, a Ukraine that's not within the customs union, Ukraine that's not within the Eurasian Union, Russia can never be that threatening empire that it was in the 20th century. That's why the stakes are so high. And unfortunately, about a year and a half ago, I read when one of the top advisors of President Putin said that notwithstanding how much the Ukrainian people want to change and want to do whatever is necessary in order to be Euro-integrated, Europe just does not want that. opportunity to ensure many things, including when I was talking about security and stability in the world. We are ensuring that Russia will never be that threatening empire that it was in the 20th century. And I think in the long run, those changes will eventually bring democracy and the rule of law even in Russia.
There's another question here.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for your lecture. I'm Haska, and as a historian, I have the following question. I was wondering what marks did the Soviet history exactly leave on the economic situation of Ukraine, and what impact does it have today? Would you maybe elaborate on that?
What history?
Yes.
Well, the history is a very difficult history. Ukraine's history, Ukrainian-Russian relations include very, very difficult moments. They include the made-by-man famine of 1932-33, where, according to estimates, varies between 5 to 10 million Ukrainians perishing from starvation within 1 year. I think that the history in the long run is a history essentially of one country constantly violating the norms of international laws and forcing itself on Ukraine. I think that history is being played out today with Russia not accepting Ukraine's choice and trying to, with the invasion and illegal occupation of Crimea, with the war in eastern Ukraine, Russia is essentially trying to ensure that, that it can keep that country constantly unstable. It can lead, and that's also in part to your response to your question, that Russia wants to create a frozen conflict in order to ensure that it can bring back Ukraine into the fold as it had it historically. I think that is the danger. And actually, when you look at what President Putin has declared last year, he has not only said what I've said about Ukraine, that Ukraine is not a state, but he has now said that Kazakhstan is not even a country. And he has said that as president of Russia, he has the right and the obligation to defend Russians and Russian-speaking individuals wherever they may be. And if his idea of protecting Russians and Russian interests are the same as they were in Ukraine, then the Prime Minister's Ukraine statement to the effect that for Russia, it's not about Luhansk, it's not about Donetsk, it's about Ukraine. It's to get back fully Ukraine. I am saying worse than the Prime Minister of Ukraine. I'm saying that Russia's ambitions will go beyond Ukraine. And that's why today we have not only an opportunity to bring a substantial part of the world to be a democratic, a European governed in the sense of norms and legislation and regulations country, but we have also the opportunity to ensure that Russian invasion stops at the Ukrainian borders and does not go further and threaten peace and stability in Europe.
Thank you. I see one question in the back. First, two questions. That's great. 3. So let's take all 3 of them and then try to answer them together so we can have more questions being dealt with. So briefly ask your question and then I'll move on to the next question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Niels. First of all, thank you for your lecture. And before I begin my question, are you familiar with Geen Pijl?
With?
Geen Pijl. Yeah, it's a Dutch name, funny name. So Well, let me briefly explain it. It's an action started by an online Dutch media channel to gain no votes against the treaty with Ukraine. And how much do you think there's Russian interference in this action for getting no votes against the treaty?
I'll tell you this, I'm not an expert on evaluating how much Russia spends, but I can tell you that about 4 weeks ago, during a Senate hearing in the United States, there was an assessment that Russia spends about $1.8 billion in order to disinform the West, and most of that disinformation currently is directed in order to ensure that the Western countries will ultimately conclude that Ukraine is a failed state. So I think that in answer to your, a short answer to your question would have been tremendous. It's a tremendous investment in dollars and people resources. And probably the only thing today that was not possible, let's say, 40 years ago, that gives a fighting chance in order to get the right message out is social media, where actually people can learn and communicate that message further and further and further. And I certainly encourage anybody that I was able to convince tonight to get that message across through social media in order to ensure that it actually does get understood. I think that very often people will, because of Russian disinformation, say that Ukraine is still a corrupt country, that nothing has changed there. And I think that I have provided you a lot of arguments and examples that demonstrate that maybe we can make an assessment that that's not as much as we would have liked it to be. But certainly Ukraine is changing, and clearly Ukraine is fighting corruption, and clearly Ukraine is adopting legislation in order to become more and more of a truly European country.
Thank you very much. My name is Elliot. Yesterday I saw a small documentary about two Dutch entrepreneurs who were active in Ukraine and were talking about the corruption that they faced. You saw it?
I didn't see it, I heard it.
Oh, you heard it, yeah. One person even had to face people who were armed who prohibited him from entering his factory. In your speech you also talked about the anti-corruption agency that Ukraine now has. I was wondering, how is the fight against corruption going, and do you think that it could still hamper international trade and foreign direct investment to Ukraine?
I think that what Ukraine has managed to do so far is to create an anti-corruption bureau and various mechanisms in order to have a real fighting chance against corruption. But as you know, one needs first the political will to do that. Then one has to implement the necessary legislation and regulations in order to allow that to happen. And then one must ensure that what has been adopted is actually implemented. I have tried in my presentation to show that currently there are 20 allegations that are being analyzed against cabinet ministers, that various top individuals in various enterprises are being the object of investigation. And when one looks from the Russian side and tries to disinform the world, well, one says, see, there are 20 people in the cabinet that are corrupt. So we've been telling you all along that there's corruption in Ukraine, and it's a catch-22 kind of cycle. Actually, the fact that those people are being the object of allegations and investigation shows that there has been a change in the political will of the governing authorities of Ukraine to ensure that corruption is being addressed. And yes, during this period of transition, there will be those unfortunate incidents. And that's why I try to balance that, because that is what makes news. But I also wanted to balance that with success stories in order to ensure that the incidents will be less and less occurring with the changes that are being implemented. And during the transition, some of the dirt will come out. But that dirt, when it comes out, is dirt that comes out because there's a actual, genuine fight against corruption. And not that because Ukraine has all of a sudden become even more corrupt. So I think that, in answer to your question, there are very serious mechanisms that are being implemented, and the new police force in Ukraine, various mechanisms that are being implemented in order to ensure that there is a fight against corruption, the various transparency registers to ensure that it's harder and harder to corrupt a civil servant. And if I had a crystal ball, I'd tell you exactly what's going to happen, but since I don't, I can only tell you that when one implements the right change in legislation, in regulation, if there is a political will to fight corruption, well, ultimately the results will follow. And that's what I think, and that's the direction that Ukraine will be taking.
So, any more questions? I see 1, 2, 3. Let's start here, and then I'll get over to that side again. Go ahead.
My name is Rob. First of all, thank you for your time and your convincing arguments. You mentioned the reform already happening and the benefits the association agreement would have for both Ukraine and our side. I was wondering, you mentioned you a very developed country, a lot of IT doctors, and a lot of willing entrepreneurs don't have the resources to start. You also mentioned the Horizon 22 funding application for which they could apply the fund. As a employee at a Dutch software company, we're also applying this year for Horizon 22, actually twice.
Mm-hmm.
I speak to a lot of Dutch software entrepreneurs. From their point of view, business law-wise, they're viewing the entry of Ukraine into this association agreement as a form of added competition. They're actually, the opportunities are thinned when it comes to applicating for instance, EU funding. What would you say to them? Because they have a personal conflict of interest. Actually, I have as well on this level.
Well, the only thing I would say is, and I would rely on those businessmen that have said that what Ukraine, a European Ukraine, will be, is it will allow everybody to understand the rules, so that when you come to Ukraine, you will not wonder which rules apply, how are they different from the EU. You will know exactly what are the rules. You will know that the system is substantially less corrupt, and then competition will ensure that the most competent businessmen actually survive. And I think that that is the same in any part of the world. And I think that those that are actually the most advanced, the ones that can offer the best service or the best product to the consumer, those that deserve to flourish and to continue. As long as the playing field is leveled, and everybody, as that businessman that I was quoting said, that everybody has to play with the same rules. That nobody has an easier track to get to some permit or to get some kind of a kickback, but everybody plays along the same rules, and then the rules of the market will prevail, and those that offer the best product will be thriving, and those that don't will have to find something else to do.
Okay, we had 2 questions there, but I want to abuse my prerogative as a host to also ask a few questions, but I'll keep you in mind. So I want to play just a little bit of devil's advocate, or at least to try and sound you out on some of the arguments that we've heard. So I think the concern with a lot of voters is not so much with Ukraine or free trade per se. If you look at the document, I think 330 pages, there are 17 of them that are actually about anything related to politics. Most of it is just standards being agreed upon to make trade easier. But a lot of people are more concerned with the EU aspect of it. It's a treaty between the EU on one hand and Ukraine on the other hand. And I think actually even some of the opponents of the agreement, the proponents of the referendum on it, namely of Geen Pijl and Forum voor Democratie and whatnot, have actually said, well, if you're against Europe and what the EU stands for, then you should vote against this association agreement. So my question is twofold. First of all, why are they wrong? Because I presume that you do not agree. And secondly, is there really no wish or ambition for the Ukrainians to become members of the European Union on the short term? Because what you've said is that most Ukrainians realize that it's not feasible in the short term. But at the same time, I can imagine, or I would imagine, that there's actually a very large part that do really hope that actually it does happen within 5 or 10 years, and that do actually feel like this is a first step towards becoming a member of the European Union, and that will actually get disillusioned if it doesn't actually become more concrete on the relatively short term. So I can imagine that's a concern that some Dutch voters have, that they're maybe making a promise towards the Ukrainians about membership or prospective membership that they're not really sure about, at least not for the next 10 or 15 years. So those two aspects are really not saying something about integration, and why should we see this separate from what we think about the European Union?
I'll start with the second part of your question because I think it's the easier one to answer. I think that there's clearly no one that thinks in what I would say in technicolor to the point of thinking that this agreement will be a fast track to membership. Not in the EU, not in Ukraine, not in the Ukrainian diaspora. I think that everybody understands that this is not about membership, it's rather about changing Ukraine for Ukraine to become like all the other EU member states, to be governed by the same legislation, regulations, and values which the people in civil society have already clearly demonstrated that they want to be to abide by. I don't think that there's anybody that's fooling the Ukrainian population on this issue, and I think that those that are quote unquote protecting Ukraine against that type of message are definitely wrong. They are grasping at any issue in order to ensure a no vote. I think that clearly today in Ukraine everybody understands what this is about, or the extreme vast majority understand what this is all about. I think that EU leaders have clearly and unequivocally, both in Brussels and in Ukraine, have said that this is not about membership. Nobody is being misled on this issue. I assure you, and I assure you for having talked with the highest authorities in Ukraine, that nobody thinks that this agreement is fast-tracking to membership. I think that clearly the European Union has its regulations, its legislation, its rules that enable a country to apply for membership, and that country that applies will have to abide by those rules, and when it's ready, the European Union will decide to accept it, and if it's not, it will not. So So I don't think that there is any illusion or that somebody will be disillusioned in 2 or 3 years saying, we thought that this was about a fast tracking to membership and we're disappointed that it's not happening. At least anybody that would say that is somebody that did not listen to news or must have been living in isolation for quite some time, because that has been said over and over ad nauseum. On the first issue, I think that clearly this agreement is about change, and I think that what people that are fighting or during this referendum with various hidden agendas, whatever they may be, including a hidden agenda to pass on message to the EU that they're frustrated with certain of the EU structures, with certain of the EU policies, with certain of the EU politicians. Just like those that, notwithstanding how good an agreement or a piece of legislation can be, will always be those that will vote anti-establishment, because that's who they are. And I think all of those elements make one fatal mistake. And I say fatal, and I measure my words. Fatal because they assume that it's either the association agreement with everything that I presented happening and Ukraine evolving in that fashion, and for it to be a win-win situation, or it will be the status quo. And I think the fatal mistake that all of those that are either anti-establishment, anti-EU make is they think that it will be the status quo if this agreement does not pass. It will not. Ukraine will clearly become, in that type of a scenario, the object of more Russian aggression. Economic aggression, military aggression, and I'm saying that this imperialist appetite of President Putin will not stop at Ukraine's borders. So I think it's high time for people to realize that their difficulties, their frustrations, well or not well-founded regarding the EU, is a battle for another day. This is a turning point that will determine whether Europe is a secure, stable, and has a chance to flourish and to prosper. And one should not risk that kind of a future for any other hidden agenda.
Crystal clear. So I promised the two gentlemen to my left to have their questions. So you have one as well, or please, and then pass it to the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruben. In my eyes, the association agreement is mainly about soft power. It's about trade agreements, it's about human rights and anti-corruption. But since Ukraine is in an armed conflict in the east, I was wondering, do you think the EU or NATO should support Ukraine in a military way? Thank you.
I think that the NATO or the EU have an opportunity to ensure that without what the American presidents like to say, without boots on the ground, they can ensure that Russian invasion stops at Ukraine's borders. So I think that my answer to you would be, I think that if the NATO and Western democracies would support Ukraine, not by sending soldiers, by sending the necessary defensive weapons to ensure that Ukraine can protect its borders in conformity with the UN Charter, international conventions, I think that it will be a much lesser sacrifice than if the Russian president is allowed to grab more and more Ukrainian territory, because I can assure you of one thing. President Putin only understands a language of strength. And I was at a convention in Lithuania when President Yanukovych, the previous president, was supposed to sign the Ukraine Association Agreement. And I was driving in a bus, and in that bus there was an activist from Russia, and he was a journalist and an NGO leader, and he was discussing with some French journalists about the situation in Russia and Ukraine and the interaction with Western society. And he said that they were discussing about President Obama, and this journalist and the Russian activist said President Putin does not have too much respect for President Obama's foreign policy and his red line, because he understands that President Obama's red line is a moving red line. And then they said, well, who would he respect? And they were disparaging the previous president, and this activist said, you know, one thing was clear with George W. Bush. We can like him, dislike him, but at least President Putin understood that for him a red line was a red line. And he would not have done what he has done if the international community would have drawn the red line at the borders of Ukraine. And I'm saying that if the international community had reacted the same way that it has reacted now with sanctions for the aggression in eastern Ukraine, had it reacted in that fashion immediately when the little green men were invading Crimea, we might not have been living the hell in eastern Ukraine. So the short answer is that with President Putin, I think that if there is a clear, unequivocal message of Western democracies, starting with the referendum here in the Netherlands, to the effect that the international community believes that Ukraine, as any other country, is entitled to make its own decisions about its future, I think the Russian president will ultimately understand that message. But if the message is always embroiled in some kind of a controversy, and there's always weakness and weak players, President Putin thrives on weakness. And when we think that a firm position is threatening to peace, I assure you it's quite the contrary. A very firm and clear position will ensure peace and stability in the world.
Carry a large stick and tread softly, as Roosevelt once said. I promised another question, but unfortunately we're out of time, and our distinguished speaker has trained to catch, as I gather. So before I ask all of you to applaud, of course, very warmly, I'm curious about one thing. Who's going to vote on the 6th of April? Who's going to vote on the referendum? And who is going to vote in favor? Be honest, be honest. There's no wrong answers, of course. Who's contemplating voting against? There's also a few people considering that. That's about 5 or 4. Okay. So I hope that at any rate, whatever you vote, you're now able to make a more informed decision. I hope that this contributes to democracy, whichever way the vote goes on the 6th of April. I would like to thank all of you for your attention and for your very insightful and interesting questions. And of course, I would like to thank Eugene Jolly for a very, very inspiring lecture and Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You've said a couple of... Oh, thank you.
As always, we have a small attention for
thank you.
of course.
You said twice that you took advantage of a privilege as the host. I just want to use once that advantage as the speaker and close with the following. I think that very often Ukraine is being portrayed in various ways, and very often we see the war, people are accentuating the corruption. We have hired at the Ukrainian World Congress a young person from Ukraine, your age, to be our EU-Ukraine liaison officer in Brussels. That person is Mariana Yaroshevich. We'd just like you to listen very carefully in closing some of the words that she has to say in order to try to convince whoever's still not convinced, A, to go vote, and to vote for a better future for Ukrainians and for Europeans. What it means to her and what it means to people like her, this opportunity that's on the table today. So then if you could be kind enough.
Good evening, everyone. I was actually not supposed to take the floor, as I'm only accompanying Mr. President here. But today, earlier, we had a meeting in Senate where there was a senator asking the following question. She said that she understands more or less the benefits that the association agreement has for adults, for businessmen, for people of older generations. But she said that she has an 18-year-old daughter that has become recently a first-time voter, and she wanted to gain her vote. So she asked Mr. President the question of how she could impact her or influence her. And I was sitting there and thinking to myself, well, I'm probably one of the living examples of how actually rapprochement of the EU and Ukraine can eliminate those borders. Because I studied myself in Maastricht a couple of years ago. I did the degree in European Studies. Then I moved to Belgium and did the degree also in EU International Relations. I'm Ukrainian, but I have a privilege of actually living in Western society, in your society, without feeling any differences, without feeling that I'm a third country national, that my rights are in one way or the other violated. And I would actually like more of my compatriots, of my friends, of my neighbors to have the same opportunity. Today I'm still a lucky exception, but I want these opportunities to be available for entire generation. So actually when you think about voting, you're not only voting like here and now, but you are also think about it from perspective of the future. And Ukrainians are very welcoming and embracing nations. And actually, I do think that what is needed is more interaction, is more exchange, is more communication, and more joint and collective effort in making Europe